It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here and our very special guest. I will very briefly tell you about the framework within which this talk has been organized, and then we'll introduce our speaker. And I would like to upfront introduce also my colleagues with whom we are doing this course together. It's taught jointly with Professor Renata Ujec, head of the Legal Studies Department and chair of the Comparative Constitutional Law program, and also with Jeremy Braverman, visual and media education specialist here at CEU, and Jesse Labov, researcher at the Center for Media Data and Society. We also have two teaching assistants with us, Orshoya Shudar and Astrea Pejovic, and I would like to thank Johnny Hunter, the media and visual education assistant, who will be recording this talk and also make sure that it will be preserved for posterity and made available wider to those who couldn't be with us tonight. So I would like to thank the Visual Themes Initiative for supporting this course, and also Sylvie Nemat, the VSP coordinator, and Tunde Sabo, coordinator of the Legal Studies Department, who were helping in organizing this talk and also other activities within the framework of this course. This course is an introduction into the methods of working with cinematic and photographic images as visual sources for research in a variety of humanities and social sciences, and it is a great initiative that is taking place at this university for several years already to introduce university-wide courses that brings together students and faculty from across departments. Understanding and acknowledging the critical importance of visual material and visual literacy in the 21st century, this course is the first one at CEU to address the methodological issues of working with visual material. And its aim is quite challenging. It is not to give a chronological narrative of developments in film or photography. It's not to give the ultimate or true interpretation to a given selection of images. It is not to teach a canon of great auteurs or great film and photography makers, but it is to expose a multiplicity of possibilities of working with visual material, with still and moving images, and to do it through a set of conceptual issues, including questions of the production and reception contexts, the materiality of images, the construction of the other in various historical contexts, the strategies of exhibition and display, principles of curatorship, the role of the archive as a social institution and also as a system that is supporting, preserving, arranging, and silencing certain historical narratives through the use of images, and finally also the possibilities of rethinking the principles of visual storytelling in the 21st century in the format of the web and new media. So throughout these themes, we are constantly returning to the notion of the construction of objectivity, the evidentiary potential of visual material, and the conditioning of the interpretative frameworks, the appropriation of the redefinition of visual imagery in different contexts. So the first public lecture resonates with the themes that we have already started discussing in the classroom, and it refracts them in, as we will see, a very productive way. This public lecture will be followed by a seminar tomorrow for the university-wide course, and tonight it is my pleasure to see not only students but a broader community of CEU and beyond CEU colleagues. And it is a great pleasure to welcome Eyal Sivan, a documentary filmmaker and media theorist, who was born in Haifa, grew up in Jerusalem, then moved to Paris, and is currently teaching in Amsterdam, where he is giving courses at the Master in Film at the Netherlands Film Academy. He is also a member of the editorial board of the Paris-based publishing house La Fabrique Édition, and has been teaching widely at different film programs combining theory and practice, something that we're also trying to do here at this university in the past few years. Eyal Sivan is a very renowned and multiply awarded filmmaker. His films were screened all over the world, and we're very happy that several of them were screened here in Budapest in cinemas within the framework of Verzio International Documentary Human Rights Film Festival, namely the films The Specialist, I Love You All, and Jaffa, The Clockwork Orange, some of the films that I think will be addressed in this talk. These films raise and point point the finger and point our attention to the most controversial historical issues, and they also work as meta-statements, as meta-reflections on the power of images in shaping our understanding of a particular period, problem, or character. And beside or beyond the film works, Eyal Sivan also made a number of other media works and installations. In 2010 and 2012, he participated in Berlin Documentary Forum 1 and 2, addressing new practices across disciplines and speaking about Montage Interdit, his new web-based project. In 2012, he presented a multi-screen video show towards a common archive, Testimonies of Zionist Veterans of 1948, another very important and controversial and sensitive and very timely initiative. In addition to filmmaking and doing media work, Eyal Sivan publishes and lectures on a variety of issues, including Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the ethics of documentary filmmaking, political crimes and the representation and political use of memory. All of these themes are really of crucial centrality to our course. And it is my pleasure to finally announce the title of today's talk, Brushing History Against the Grain, Critical Knowledge Production in and Through Radical Cinematic Archival Practices. And please join me in welcoming Eyal Sivan.
Thank you very much for being here. It's my pleasure, especially that I heard that you are not moving, that Central European University is staying and resisting, which is good. I think that I have two important duties in this beginning of lecture. Well, in this kind of occasion, it seems obvious to you, for example, that the speaker's legitimacy, which is me, comes from my position as a speaker on one hand and from my title from the other. But I would like to dedicate this talk to a kind of a part which is my activity as experiential knowledge producer. And I'm using the experiential knowledge producer, of course, in order kind of to oppose it or to be next to what I will call the official knowledge producers, which are institutions of knowledge like the university. Well, the second important point is maybe to go beyond my place of birth and where I was raised, and to put it as a position, or if you want, as we are used to say among makers, image makers, point of view. So, as I said, I'm speaking now, or I will be speaking from my experience of 30 years of documentary filmmaking, which a big part of it was and is dedicated to, as was said, to questions of history and memory, which will be also what I will try to tackle here, and archival material. My lab, if I may say so, or the terrain, was for many years Palestine, Israel, both space and conflict. And this is, of course, an excellent terrain when it comes to history and memory. Israel. Well, Israel is a country where the political use, or what I called already in the 19th, the instrumentalization of historical memory, or what we call memory, is a constitutive part of Israel political culture. Well, I would say even more that Israel's policy, and in this regard, doesn't really matter whether it will be right, left, center, up, down, north, south, gains its moral credit and also its position thanks to the common acceptance that this country, Israel, is the country of the genocide survivors, or the Judeocide survivors, what we're used to call the Holocaust. Everyone, on different level, claims over there, or we claim, that our legitimacy, and in this regard also our actions, and now I'm speaking in Israeli, is done in the memory, through the memory, by the memory of the Jewish victims and survivors of Second World War genocide. Well, as you know better than me, this is not a specificity of Israel. It became a come of a trend, and it became also a driven force for many former communist or Eastern European countries using memory in order to justify the present and, I imagine, also the future. Well, in Israel, we did out of it a culture. And this culture, this political culture, is twinned. It's related directly to what I will call politics of representation. Well, I said already that the representation is the idea itself of gaining moral authority and legitimacy from the notion of memory, things that I will come back to it. But maybe I will have to say another thing. Well, such a complex, or some of you would say pompous or pretentious title need to be unpacked for a second. Many of you, I'm always late, so it doesn't matter. I was born late. No, I'm serious. I'm the last one to complain. Even former students of mine are here, at least I see one who knows that it's true. Well, as I said, such a complex or pompous, pretentious title need to be unpacked. Well, many of you have already recognized Walter Benjamin's describing in his famous fragment on the concept of history, of philosophy of history, the historical materialists' task as to brush history against the grain. Well, brushing history against the grain, which is the idea to look at history from another point of view, is what I was trying to do and hopefully trying to transmit in the last decades. Well, I'm talking about point of view and from where we are talking, because I believe that the question itself of the relation to the practice, in any kind of experiential practice, will be the standing point and the point of view. Understanding point of view from the practitioner perspective, which is not point of view, which is what I think, when we use in the everyday language notion, I will tell you my point of view, means I will tell you what I think. Point of view, for me, and I would say for us, practitioner, is from where we're speaking and toward what we are looking at. Well, in the fragments on the philosophy of history, Benjamin reminds us that in the tradition of the oppressed, or the tradition of the oppressed, the state of exception, or the moment of exception, it's not an exception, but a rule. Let's try to interpret it a second, the idea of the tradition of the oppressed from the point of view of the oppressed. What the oppressed sees, what the oppressed is, and where the oppressed is looking at. Well, this will be the first point that I will try to tackle in this lecture. The other is what I'm calling the critical production of knowledge. And the critical production of knowledge is both the critical for the present time and the critique posed to modes of production of knowledge. I spoke about the idea of the practitioner as a producer of experiential knowledge. And finally, the notion of radicality, the notion of radicality. Remember that radicality is linked in the current discourse to the notion of the extremes. And being on the extreme, it's not just about leaving the center to be center, but it is taking distance from normopathy on one hand, and, if you want, mainstream. In my work, through my work, which was about trying to unpack mechanics, or what I call clockwork of power, through their representation, self-representation, I kind of noticed or realized after many years that in fact the idea of radicality of the extreme, which is what we are being called to be aware and also suspicious from, in fact doesn't stand when we look at historical event. Most of criminal collective event did not come from the extreme of the radicality, but rather, for what we could say, the mainstream itself. So in this regard, it's a way to pose the radicality as a place, the radicality and the extreme, if you want, as a place looking at the mainstream. Well, maybe I should, in fact, come back and to remind you, looking at the average age around you, that of course I'm highly influenced from the moment that I grew up, which is the 80s and the 90s of last century. And the discourse at that time, well, last century's discourse, beginning in the 70s, and mainly in the 80s in the documentary practice, is in fact the discourse about memory, about redeeming the archive, redeeming the history in the clear aim, goal, and belief that history can be a teacher for the future, and memory can be a vaccine for the future. I think that those who grew up in the 21st century look at this kind of assumptions and believe with a small ironic smile. Did any regime of Eastern Europe really learn from history? Did we Jews learn really from memory and history? Well, is there any one nation that actually learn of history? Learn of history not to do, or learn contrary from history how to do? Well, I think that the question of memory as being a vaccine against future crime is an illusion that is coming from a theoretical approach to the idea of what's memory about. Let's try to look at memory from the place of the practice, cinematic practice itself. Can I ask you for a bit? I promised practice. This is the equivalent of memory when it comes to the cinematic practice. Some of you would say it's a window. The other would say it's four shades that are hiding something in order to show something else. I position myself in the second part. Well, memory, as we know it, is four shades and even much more in order to show a fragment of something. When it comes to memory, we should maybe start from questioning, like in the case of the frame, which is not what is seen, but what actually was being hidden. Which brings us to the question, which is what we're given to see and not what there is there. But it would be absolutely pretentious, anachronistic, and unfair from my behalf to pretend that I got to those conclusions, or I knew those conclusions a priori to the practice itself. And this demands a small self-critique, if we allow you. I know it's not fashionable anymore. I would like to start by showing one extract from my very first film, the opening of a film which is called Aqaba Jabr, Passing Through. Aqaba Jabr, it's a Palestinian refugee camp which is situated 30 kilometers to the east of the city of Jerusalem when I grew up. And in fact, Aqaba Jabr, this place, this camp, is not far from the city of Jericho, a place that in the summer we were used to go to restaurants in this desert oasis. We were passing on the road a place that looked like a ghost town, a phantom town. Many years later, when I came to Paris and I decided to do my very first film, I was intrigued by this place that I discovered that it's a refugee camp. Well, I was shooting there 38 years after the displaced people settled. I'll show you the opening.
شو في؟
تفضل تعال معي هنا احكي معك تعال احكي معك
أنا بتصور شيخو
بدي اقول لك وقف معي هنا بس احكي معك
بتصور شو بدل؟
هذول بدهم يعملوا فيلم عن حياتنا هان
على ايش؟
عن حياتنا هان
مش بدهم يصوروا؟
اسمعني اسم الفيلم
ها
حياة عابر سبيل 38 سنة هان
هذول بده ياخذوا صورنا على امريكا وبعدين يحطوهم في شو اسمه هذا في التلفزيونات.
If I wanted to show just this very first extract is in order to ascribe the beginning of my practice in the core of the documentary tradition, which without brushing its tradition against its grain, its historical grain, I feel that I cannot perceive. Why? Well, as every documentarist, or most of the documentarists, white in Israel, less white when I'm in Europe, belonging to the white. Of course, one of the core object of the documentary is what we call the other or the subaltern. This is why the documentary practice, from its beginning of its tradition, it's also the tradition of othering and subjectivization. Well, this doesn't come from nowhere. And I believe that going back to the very first moment, or what is called the very first moment of cinema, we can get already the answer for that. Many of you know, you can live it, you can live it. Many of you might know this second film in extract from the history of cinema. You might ask, what's the relation between the two? Between the extra that you just saw of my film and this one? Well, the Lumière brothers, this French bourgeois family, Protestant family, which had this factory, when they start to make cinema, in fact, they will establish the tradition of the cinema practice, which is to look from the standpoint of the power to the powerless. Just recall a second the subjects of the documentary practice: prisoners, women, refugees, non-whites, etc., etc. I mean, this tradition, which is me, the one that have the power, hiding behind the camera, and giving the possibility to the subaltern, giving the possibility to the other to speak up, giving an image to the other, will be inscribed and will be the tradition of cinema practice until, unfortunately, now. It's not by chance that the next step that will do the Lumiere brothers will be, in fact, to send their camera persons, on one hand, to the East, to the Middle East, to the Bible land, to Palestine, and to try to find the origin of humanity in the savage, sending the camera persons to Mexico, Latin America, in order to have in these two poles the beginning of humanity. Bible on one hand, the savage in the other. I'm like the many others joined this tradition. It took me maybe one practice in order to come and to shift the point of view, which is not anymore to look from my position of the power, the white, in my case also the settler, towards the subaltern, but to try to think what are the traces of the subaltern gaze. Well, one of the thing is the attempt to understand the functionality or the use or what is the goal in this kind of representation. I will do it short because this is not the core of our subject. Well, I believe that cinema, in fact, where it's the moment of its appearance, which is the high moment of both colonialism and secularism, became or becomes or will take the place of a kind of what I will call a secular church. A secular church in the sense that in cinema, also in university, we sit a little bit like in church. Everybody is sitting here, looking up at the screen, in this case looking up at the documentary screen, and finding on the documentary screen those figures which I would say are the redeeming figures, those who suffer for us. Like this man which is in the church, hanged off the wall. We are there watching with compassion the suffering of the other. It's redeeming, but it's also a message. If we can feel the suffering, if we can have the feeling of compassion, this signifies that in a certain way we are good. And this is what I recognize in the documentary practice. In its tradition of the documentary pressing, it's redeeming, in fact, the spectator and not the redemption of the object of the screen, or especially the subject of the screen. Well, in the 80s, 1980s, when I started my practice, 1987, occurred the first Palestinian uprising in the occupied territory, Palestinian occupied territories, which is the first Intifada. And the entire world saw on screens, television screens, and the media, and we were talking before internet, no Twitter, etc., on television worldwide, saw Israeli young soldier obeying to one order which was given from the man that became after a symbol of peace, Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin, murdered in the 90s. Well, he gave the order to break the bones of hands and legs of Palestinian demonstrators that at the time were using stones, and this way it's called the Stone Uprising. I was already in the West at that time. I left Israel before. And the recurrent question that I was asked, which honestly, I imagine that more than one here already asked, how it's possible that people that suffered so much in their history are able to inflict suffering to others? This question, which is asked regularly about Israel, it's also asked about other situations. How it's possible that, in fact, we didn't learn from history and we were not vaccinated from history. I would like to argue after the next extract that maybe we should shift the question. This extract is from the film Is Called Slave of Memory.
וגם להזדקף, לעשות עם הידיים, שיהיה גם עצוב ועבדים היינו, וכשאומרים אתה בני חורים, להזדקף. בני חורים זה לא עבדים. טוב? 3, 4. עבדים היינו, אתה בני חורים, בני חורים.
Well, if there is one Israeli here, and I think that I recognize one, of course recognize the kindergarten or school or high school every year, each time in April, singing, we were slave, now we are. In fact, this embodied memory, this memory through the body. I mean, here we're seeing kids that will be in 15 years, will be soldiers. Well, this embodied memory, it's not, in fact, creating what we are wishing for, which is a vaccine, which is an understanding. I would like to argue that, in fact, it's absolutely the contrary. That, in fact, this kind of memory, it's permissive. It's the regime of justification itself. And this, in fact, are processes of allowing, of permission. I would show you another extra. Well, embodying the victim figure is embodying also the figure of innocency. Hannah Arendt reminds us that in front of the gas chamber, even the Jewish raper or murderer is innocent, but only facing the gas chamber. Well, this permissive memory to talk about, it's a way of putting and shuffling the historical archive in a certain way, which is the building of an I, which is a victim, was victim, is victim, and i.e. will be victim or potentially victim. This is also a permissive memory which allows to consider any kind of act coming from the victim as an act of self-defense by definition. But this is also this practice, if you want. It is already a beginning of a shifting of a point of view. I am one of those kids. And I was one of those kids, I want to believe. And I see some that are saying, doing like this with their heads, I imagine that there were some of those kids. Which means that in a certain moment, I didn't put myself in front of the camera, but I turned the camera to us, to those who have the power, not to those who are the victim, but those who have the power, which are today the dominators, in order to try to unpack, in order to try to dissecate the regime of justification. Well, what I discovered by shifting the interview, it's the high importance of what will become later my main and central practice, and on this I would like to concentrate, which is redeeming the perpetrator's regime of justification. One of the most important, and I apologize being a little bit chronological, one of the most important events in our education of Israelis, and a moment which was fundamental for the historical building of the Holocaust genocide / Shoah conscience in Europe, was the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. Every year, in permanent, we are being shown extracts from the trial as Israeli peoples of around the world. There is almost no film until the end of 90s that was done about the history of Second World War and the Jewish genocide that doesn't use extras from the Eichmann trial that took place in Jerusalem. Well, it happened to be that in between this film is called Slaves of Memory, and a film which is the specialist that I dedicated to the use of the archival material of Eichmann trial. It's a film that I did about the question of obedience and disobedience with an Israeli Jewish professor, philosopher, chemist, and numerous titled Professor Eyal Sivan. Well, the being in the Jerusalem archive, which are called the Jerusalem University Archive, which are called the Spielberg Archive, just because Spielberg family gave some millions of dollars in order the archive to be under name, and it became the Jewish Central Archive at the Hebrew University. Well, I was looking for some archival material, which I didn't use until then, my practice, in a very naive and innocent way, of course, which is the attitude of illustration, considering that the archive could give an historical illustration to a textual moment or to describe, which was supposed to be the opening of that film about the philosopher. Sitting in this archive, getting a small editing room when we were choosing things in archive, I was sitting next to cassettes which was written Eichmann trial. And Eichmann trial, for me, of course, Eichmann trial was both a memory of a child from school, but also the permanent example that was given to the idea of absolute obedience, the idea of obedience itself. Well, I started to be intrigued by this material. Coming back to Paris, at the time living in Paris, I was talking to a friend of mine, Ronnie Broman, former president of Médecins Sans Frontières. So I want to be, as being too much talkative, I want to be sure that I'm on time. Well, talking to him, he asked me, do you know Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt? Maybe some of you know Eichmann in Jerusalem, the report on the banality of evil, which is a text published by Hannah Arendt after she went to Jerusalem to be witness in the trial. I didn't know that book. I didn't know that book, despite my extensive Israeli Holocaust / Shoah education. And the reason was because of the content of the book itself, a book that was not translated to Hebrew until we bought the rights and translated it in 2000 following the film. Well, I was asking the archive about the originals of those cassettes. We decided to make a film, adapting Hannah Arendt to the screen, Hannah Arendt's book to the screen, and I was asking the archive about the original of those cassettes. And the answer was, those are the originals. said it's impossible that those original cassettes that were started to be fabricated, BVU, low bands, started to fabricate in 1974 cannot be the original of a trial that took place in 1961 by the Finnish. So they admitted in a certain moment that those are not original, but in fact this is what is interesting in the Eichmann trial and you don't need nothing else. So I started to look what is interesting in the Eichmann trial. And I discovered, astonished, which is that in the 78 hour that composed the material that the archive was putting available to the world, researchers, filmmakers, etc., appear only victims, only testimonies of victims. Eichmann says one sentence, "I'm not guilty." And all the rest are just the witnesses and that general attorney. So I came back to the book of Arendt and realized that Eichmann, either she invented, either there is something missing in the memory of what was available. Because Eichmann indeed spoke. It took us entire year to find the originals and to go to trial with the Hebrew University and the archive, when finally they admitted that they don't know where are the originals. I mean, we're talking about the first ever trial of a Nazi criminal, member of a high hierarchy of the Nazi regime, that was put on trial in a trial that was entirely filmed, entirely recorded, and something that was new at that moment, technologically, which is video. Well, the Eichmann trial took place in Jerusalem in 1961, and it was an experiment, not just a justice experiment, but it was an experiment in TV production. Video is invented in the late 50s. Until the Eichmann trial, video is used in order to shoot inside studios. It's the first time that a multi-camera studio will be built outside of a television studio. It was a new building, specially built for the Eichmann trial, the House of the People. At the time, Israel was under the influence, pretending being socialist, so it was the House of the People. And in the House of the People, the Court of Jerusalem was brought, the court was on the scene, and the public was in the auditorium. But the material disappeared. It took us some time to find the material, and finally we found it in a very cool and protected place, which were the unused toilets of the Hebrew law department. In the basement, you have this university toilet, and on each toilet there were piles of those videos. Fortunately, it's cool as a place, clean, everything was protected. But what was interesting was that the archive was intrigued, but why you are interested in the material if the best, and I'm quoting, if the best part of the trial you already have. Let me show you the beginning of the specialist.
אני פותח את הישיבה השביעית של המשפט. היועץ המשפטי ממשיך בנאום הפתיחה שלו.
שופטיי ורבותיי, עומד בפניכם משמיד עם, אויב המין האנושי. הוא נולד אדם, אך הוא חי כנמר בג'ונגל. הוא נתן ידו למעשי אימים, אשר כל המעולל אותם מוחק את צלם האדם מעל פניו. כי ישנם מעשים שהם מחוץ לתחום האנושי, שהם מעבר למחיצה המפרידה בין אדם לחיה. ואני מבקש ממצא מבית המשפט הזה. כי הוא עשה מתוך להיטות, רצון לתאווה. עד תום. כלל לא הייתה שייכות למשרד 4 עם אושוויץ, כן במרכזים, שאחרים ישלם להגיד גיא אדולף אייכמן, בלה אותם במחנות. בגזות הקרובות צריכים היו בתים שני שכנים בתקווה להעמיד עדות ולהעניש. מה הדבר הראשון שהוא באמת מתקרא על זה? 6 מיליון שיביש. ואני הממסלציה, כולם פשיסטים, כולם דיקטטורים וגטאות, כולם אנושים. הם לא יוכלו לקום על רגליהם. זה לא אדולף אייכמן. לשלוח אצבע מרשיעה כלפי תעשייתי ולזעוק כלפי היושב שם אני מבקש שתקבעו כי בן מוות האיש הזה.
Well, I imagine that some of you noticed that there is 2 qualities of image. There is one that looks really real and authentic and old, and the other one's kind of unrecognized. Of course, the one which is which is the moment of the verdict when the attorneys are asking for pain. This is the manipulated image. This is an image which is entirely filtered. There were no scratches. Video doesn't have scratches, of course, and I said that it was in video. But this was a sign of authenticity because the specialist project, it's not just an attempt to try and to start by working the archive against the goal of the archive, which is the core of our gathering here, but it's also a digital attack on the notion of veracity of the archives themselves. And I will come back to the idea of what is an archive in this case. But just to put you in the loop of the film itself. Well, what we saw as the beginning and the starting point, I have 20 minutes. What we saw through the discourse of Attorney General Hausner, it's the common position and the idea of what will be a criminal, a big criminal, a huge criminal. First of all, he's not like us. It's an animal. It's a beast in the jungle, and in a certain way we can say that if Eichmann is a beast and an animal, so the trial of Jerusalem in 1961, it's the first trial since Middle Ages where animals are put on trial. But in fact, if there is a reason to put Eichmann on trial, it is because not a beast and an animal, because of its humanity. Because exactly what Arendt is putting and arguing, which is this appalling, ordinary person character. But this what was hid in the archive and the material that was available to the public. I mean, in order to keep the idea of a beast, of an absolute evil, a monstrous mythological figure, there is only one way. It's to silence the perpetrator itself. Because actually, what is terrifying in the perpetrator, and in this kind of perpetrator, this what was called a bureaucratic criminal, it's the fact that he is a human. And this is what I was interested in. Which means that from the very beginning, we find ourselves in a conflict, both with what at that time was the accepted, knowledgeable, scholarly position, remembering that Arendt was basically marginalized and put into a position which is a controversial position, It is controversial to consider Eichmann or the Nazi criminal as an animal, as a beast. This is not controversial, but to consider that Eichmann was a human became a controversial position. So first of all, it was to work the archive through the idea of trying to trace back the Eichmann trial, not as the platform where victims are being given voice, but in fact as a place where we can hear and understanding complicated word, but anyway, a platform of redeeming the perpetrator voice from its mythological image of an unspeakable and spokeable beast. This was the first, but also to work, in fact, the archive in order to establish something that will be later, I will theorize, as analogical memory and not as historical memory, which is what is the historical continuum in terms of semantics and mode of self-representation of a criminal within the Nazi regime and any kind of political criminals of collective crimes as we know them today. This will give place, an opening of all a practice, ongoing practice, which I'm calling framing perpetrator, which is what I'm doing through the different work. This was also, by the way, what the drive behind this film, which is Ausliebe zum Volk, which uses material basically in majority of the secret East German political police, the Stasi.
Liebe doch alle Menschen. Ich liebe doch, setzen mich doch dafür ein.
To prepare to defend our nation against the unknown, the uncertain, and the unexpected.
Состоялся как эффективный инструмент защиты мирной жизни наших народов.
Tout simplement en sécurité.
Un espacio de libertad, de seguridad y de justicia.
The dangers of inaction are far, far greater.
People on the ground providing information, and God bless them.
Welt wird dadurch sicherer.
Vertrauen ist gut. Kontrolle ist besser.
La sécurité, c'est la première des libertés. Et il convient de les rétablir.
Protect the security.
Que para la paz y la seguridad.
Must be vigilant. Must make sure we continue to focus on our homeland security.
As you might have understood from the opening of a film that I said that is entirely built from the archive of the former Stasi, former political police of East Germany, DDR, the Stasi, starts with current at the time, 2004, world leaders. Again, I'm not an historian. I'm interested in history just because it's instrumental possibility in order to emphasize the past and try to preview the future. In fact, by listening carefully to the Stasi's discourse, this is a portrait of an unseen person that speaks, that tells from the last day of his work, tells back what it was the work in the Stasi. There is no rupture in history, and this is what the archives allows us to see. In fact, what I'm looking for, it's for the continuum. But then, of course, I have to define archive, a word that I used a lot. Well, in my understanding of what is an archive, or what is the purpose of an archive, and I'm talking now of visual archive, is of course the idea of preservation of something and remembering. As I said, I'm quite reluctant to the idea of remembering in the name of remembering. But an archive, what is particularly interested in the institutional archive in this regard, that it have this dual function that, of course, Derrida already mentioned. On one hand, to provide historian, artist, etc., and more wide audience material that can be resampled and examined. But on the other hand, the archive provide an implicit narrative which is constitutive and constructing the official ideology and the narrative of the nation state. Again, there are basically two dimensions to the archive. First of all, there is the chronological, there are two dimensions in the archive, which is, first of all, the chronological and linear narration of the institution, the linearity and the continuum of the institution. Very often, archives are organized chronologically as an entrance. But this linearity, I want to argue, that it's a way, in a way, to isolate moments in time. And the question, which is the problematic and challenging, which is how to assemble moments of time through the resemblance and the recurrence appearance of what is called the persistent of history, which is how to put together, for example, the scattered archive of the French colonialism in Vietnam and the French colonialism in Algeria and the French colonialism in Black Africa. To put them together would mean to create the archive of French colonialism, which doesn't exist as such, which is, there is no major archive, there is no, what I introduces the word montage, there is not an editing or a build-up of the notion of French colonialism, just to take an example, through the archive, which means there is a scattered chronological momentums that are in the archive. The other dimension of the institutional archive, that it has to be conductive with social order. Archive is the way a given society provides its member with an imaginary from the past. Its purpose is to draw a continuity, as I said, of the nation state. Again, the intervention of the montage in this regard, which is the build-up of reference which are not chronological, to give the second dimension, it's a rupture which is within the idea of the state continuity. In this regard, of course, the ethical question of use of material, the question of the veracity, authenticity, recognition of sources is put forward in the argument. Well, I believe that the duty of archivists is one, and the duty of scholars is second, and the duty of practitioner artists is third. And to bring and to put the burden of archiving on the practitioners of archive, and here I'm talking about historians, sociologists, and us, media practitioner, is a way to displace the question of ethics. I want to take the example, the specialists that I show you, I want to take the example of I Love You All, and I will have to skip some extras, so you will have, unfortunately, to believe me. All the images that you see that you would see in the specialist are coming directly from the archive, from the archival footage. Not even one of the images that are in the film you can find in the archive. Well, I have to explain the paradox, right? All the material that we used in the film, including the film Aus Liebe zum Volk on the Stasi, this is material that comes and exists in the archive. But the continuities, the texture, the lighting even. Can we see here something? The lighting. The camera movements. The Eichmann trial was filmed in fixed cameras. All the camera movement, all the lighting. The editing, the continuities, exist only in the specialists. So you come and you say, well, we are facing here a big ethical question, which is how we know what is the original, what is the truth. Well, there is one thing. You can trace back from the specialist every image, and the film is composed of 192,000 images. We can trace back where they are in the archive, but we will not find them as they are in the archive. But I want to raise an even more problematic question, which is, even if we come and we look inside the archive and the material itself, the question of the authenticity of the material, original material in the archive, is already in question. We have two sources of sound. We have the sound on the video material, and we have the recording of the radio. If we listen to the two of them, persons do not sound the same. I would say it more critically. Eichmann do not sound the same. What is Eichmann's voice there? Well, the voice of Eichmann that you see in the specialist is the voice that Eyal Sivan choose to give to Eichmann. I mean, those are the filters. Those are the cleaning of the voice, but also because we are dealing with cinema, you will hear the body, you hear the glasses, which are what we call in cinema follies. You know, when you take glasses, it doesn't make sound. Now listen to cinema and you will see that always we hear the glasses making sound. This is Italian sound persons that invented it. They invented this small sound because in Italy all the films are being post-synchronized, so they invented the sound. This is what makes it real. I mean, Fellini already said, and this is also our work, despite being documentaries, our role is to lie truly. Our role is to lie faithfully and to make you believe. You make me believe and you make me interrogate. To make the interrogate what I'm given to be seen and not what actually is there on the screen. What is being hidden. And this is the dialectic relation that I would like to establish with the spectator, which is not about pretending any kind of authenticity, but putting forward what I said before, the idea of a point of view to be argued with. Let me advance quickly. Of course, the perpetrator getting into and putting the camera facing the perpetrator is an incredible source in order to listen, in order to recognize perpetratorship regimes of the justification in our present time. But what's interesting is that, in fact, the need of the perpetrator to speak, or I will put it otherwise. In fact, we can blame ourselves as practitioners, or maybe also historians, sociologists, and others interested in archive, which is that we are looking for what we want to find, which is we are coming from a point with a point of view that this should be a priori interrogated, looking for the testimony of history. It's one. Acknowledging that historical and memorial testimonies can be spoken out from victim is second. Going to the archive, which would be the institutional archive or the person's memory archive, from the perspective of trying to redeem the perpetratorship, is a third one. Do I really have time? Let's make an attempt, if it works. Well, the machine says that it doesn't work, so we can continue. The perpetrator is one, his voice, his image, but the production of audiovisual materials, of media and image of the perpetrator is another one. Of course, when we are talking before the period when policemen have those cameras, and we don't have surveillance cameras, and we didn't have embedded journalists in order to produce the Powers image, well, we had two possibilities. The archives on one, considering again that what we can find in the institutional archive won't be the history of the memory, but will be the artifacts of production and the modalities of production of a self-image of the power producing it, which means it won't be what we find, it won't be testimony of history, will be a testimony of a point of view on a present, which is a completely different, and of course the fiction. I would like to move to this film, which is Jaffa, the Orange's Clockwork, which is an attempt to trace back historically how was built the image of Palestine, or if you want, the image of Israel as the state and nation that redeemed the Arab desert. Colonialism, and not as Israeli colonialism. Colonialism pretends always that what it finds is desert, undevelopment, that is looking to be redeemed by the West, the white, and the powerful. Of course, Palestine was not a desert before Zionism came. Zionism, in order to justify that they are redeeming the desert, had to first of all transform the place into a desert and then to be able to rebuild it back. In order to do this, we flourished the desert. But the history of Zionism, fortunately enough, it's also the history of cinema. Zionism and cinema were basically from the 10 years aside, they are from the same moment. And Zionism from the very beginning used cinema. I want to trace, just in order to move, I would like to show back. I hope that this is the one that I'm looking for.
لقد شف دمعي فانتحبت متى أراك وهل في العمر من أمدي 1839, המצאת הצילום. הצלם הראשון שמגיע לארץ 1840. הצילומים בדרך כלל מראים מצג של ארץ חרבה ושוממה, וארץ שזועקת למערב, בוא תגאל אותי, בוא תכבוש אותי. מקום מפגר שרק מחכה שהמודרנה תבוא ותגאל אותו. וזה גם התפיסה שאחר כך הציונות תמצא.
Here is the sinew and bone, the heart and marrow of a new nation, rising at the crossroads of history. This is the Holy Land.
Alors, il faut que tu saches une chose, la Palestine, avec l'Égypte pharaonique, c'est quand même parmi les deux pays les plus photographiés de la planète et depuis l'invention de la photographie. Au départ, on a des gens qui viennent dans la grande bataille contre Darwin et l'église anglicane, puisque l'église anglicane dit non, la Genèse, le texte de la Bible, c'est pas du mythe, c'est pas du récit, c'est un livre d'histoire. Tout ce que dit la Bible, c'est des événements qui ont eu lieu. Et donc, arrive la photographie, ils disent on va vous le prouver, on va vous montrer des images. On va vous montrer comment ce que vous voyez correspond à ce que vous lisez. Et bien sûr, ils vont débarquer, ils vont voir que le lieu ne correspond pas du tout au texte. Alors, plutôt que de dire que le texte est un texte et que le lieu est un lieu, on va photographier le lieu pour qu'il entre dans le texte, pour prouver le texte.
Parcourir Israël, c'est feuilleter la Bible. S'il était besoin de preuves pour établir le droit millénaire des Juifs au sol de la Judée, on les trouverait dans...
הצלם הפלסטיני הראשון שמצלם בארץ הוא חליל רעד. הוא מגיע לכאן ב-1890 מלבנון, והוא מתחיל לצלם ברחבי הארץ. גם את האוכלוסייה הפלסטינית, גם את האוכלוסייה היהודית.
C'est un œil extrêmement banal, Rad. C'est-à-dire, il photographie ce qu'il voit, il enregistre. Certainement qu'il y a une subjectivité, mais il n'y a pas la même construction qu'on trouve chez les autres. C'est pour ça que c'est extrêmement fort, les images de Rad. Elles ont quelque chose de très naturel. Celle-là est peut-être complètement posée, c'est clair, mais elle est posée dans les gestes du travail. Contrairement aux autres photographes qui ont voulu en faire un pays divin, une terre inouïe, unique, lui, il est dans la banalité de cette terre. Ce qui est sa réalité, c'est un pays très très simple, la Palestine.
הדימויים האלה.
So, in fact, Jaffa the Orange and Clockwork take something which is called the Jaffa Orange, that in many places and certainly until the 80s was the product of export of Israel. It's around the image of the Jaffa oranges, very known in places like Britain, France, and other, that Israel and the Zionist movement build also the idea of flourishing the desert, while the orange existed in Palestine already in 16th and 17th century. But what is interesting is to trace back through the archive, is to trace back the gaze that was put on Palestine, which is the idea of projection itself, which is a completely different approach to the notion of the archive, not as revealing, in fact, not as revealing a reality, but as a signifier of the gaze, and in many cases, the gaze of power, which is not a gaze on reality, but it is a projection. And in this regard, the film is a projection on a different projection. Unfortunately, and because of time, I would like just to move to the last element, which is the limit of the notion of editing, of montage in this regard, of the build-up and the relation, due to something that every person that ever sat in front of an editing machine, or seen an editing machine, recognize, which is the problem of linearity. And this is why our understanding of history from the practice of making have something else than the constant struggle of historian with the historical material. We know from the practice that these two simultaneous movements could not exist on the timeline itself. We have to choose. It will be, let's take the example, if we had those images of 1492. 1492, what we put on the timeline, the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus, or the discovery of white men by indigenous people living in America? It's a problem. We have to choose. Writing history, when it's come to linearity of cinema, and any kind of linearity, it's about choosing. Which means that major and subaltern events, those are the decision of the editor itself in this case. What we can see and witness through the linear writing of history, it's not history, it's the choices of narration about history. Again, well, one of the ideas to come and to think about, do we have a possibility? There is a way to unpack the linearity, which is also the mode that we're thinking, and to think about another mode of narrative, which would be what we call today non-linear. Well, non-linearity, which is something which excites a lot of those people that are working with virtual reality, augmented reality, and others, it's in fact going in completely contradiction to our mode of thinking, which is in a way linear. This is why non-linearity I would like myself to replace into something that I will call multi-linearities, and how in fact to put forward the idea of multi-linearities both as a representation and an idea of a practice. One of the works that I'm working on, or maybe we will do it from the end to the beginning, let's take Montage Interdit, which is an experimental attempt in order to think multi-linearity, and in this regard we will have just to open the net because it's here. And while it's loading, while the archive is loading, yes. Montage Interdit is built out of the entire filmography of Jean-Luc Godard, the Swiss filmmaker that many think that he's French. Montage Interdit, it's a mode of tagging Godard, and the choice of Godard is because of the way that Godard is working and the subject that he is working. I would like to argue that Godard maybe is the maker trying to break historical linearities, putting and editing, re-editing together moments which the relation, it's not the historical linearity, but it's their condition themselves. Well, I tagged the entire work of Godard. I don't know if we can see it well here. I have the impression that we are here. Oh, yes. Okay. So as you can see, as I'm walking around the archive, you can see that there are tags on the image itself. So here, I don't know if you see what I see, but if I'm taking anti-Semitism, so it highlights the different elements that we can see in the archive of Godard about, for example, this is Arab. So all the archive is being tagged first, all the extras are being tagged. But then, I tried to think about an archive which, in fact, I can arrange as I get to it. Which means I'm not accepting, or you won't accept when you will start to play with Montage Interdit, the proposal of the archive as it is, but you will have the possibility to reorganize the shelves, let's call it. I'm getting into an archive which is chronological, and I want to organize it, not chronology, but through the color of the covers of the book. Well, you have the possibility to reshuffle the archive. So as I have a lot of tags, I'm using the tagging itself. Sorry, let's see, it's a question of size. So if I'm putting this, you just saw all the archive is being shuffled through titles. And also there is a new way of looking at the archive, which is in fact on the timeline itself. I can move, but on the principle, what is that it's an archive that has footnotes, as you can see. Because in the same time that it's rolling, there is up there the footnotes that is coming. So if we want to have the footnote, we just have to hear, and now we hear the footnote. But if I want to go and to rearrange the archive through its footnotes, I have footnotes. So I'm inviting you, of course, to play. It's open to everybody. It's open to everybody. In fact, this archive is being inspired from an old 11th century book, a non-linear or multilinear book which is called the Talmud. The Talmud is a book that it's one of the, it's Jewish philosophy. There is a small sentence in the middle, and around are the commentators, which are commentating. It's 400 years of commentary, or 200 to 400 years of commentary that I put together on one page as if they took place in the same time. From there is inspired, in fact, it's not inspired from new technology, it's inspired from low tech. Absolutely low tech, and not from high tech, as it could be seen. We are talking about an attempt to have an archive which doesn't impose its narration through its organization, but gives the possibility to work the material in a non-linear way, which is to relate elements, but also to record back into the archive any kind of navigation, saying, I am the last one that visited, I was looking for this and this, which means that I can take your path and build. So it's, of course, a completely new software, and it's a possibility that the archives are giving us. Of course, you can imagine that this cannot be an institutional archive. But the other possibility, and this will be maybe my ending, is a practice where I am. is a practice which in fact brings together into something which I will call the communality, both the perspective of the perpetrator and perspective of the victim, or if you want, the perspective of the one that films and the perspective of those he's being filmed. This is an example of our ongoing work, which is Common Archive 1948, which tries, in fact, to trace the story of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1947 to 1949 by Zionist forces, what is called the Nakba in Arabic, the catastrophe. This is an example taken from the city of Lod. I'm working here with an archive that I produce, which is interviews with veterans of the 1948 war, Jewish Zionist veterans on one hand, and with archives which are extensively exist, which are Palestinian survivors. It's not just the archive, it's not just us practitioners, it's not just the documentary practice that is looking for the victim's voice. It's the idea of archiving itself and filming material and the notion of testimony as such, which creates a huge amount of material of victims' voice, but in the same time exclude the possibility to access the perpetrator one. Well, just to show you a demo of how works this archive.
شو كانوا يسموا هذا الحي لما حطوا السنة؟
حي البلد القديم. كيف سموه اليهود لما اجوا على العملية؟
ليه؟
ما اعرفش. انا ما اعرفش.
وين كان باب الجيتو؟
قلت لك من السياج مسيج علينا.
وين؟ تعال فرجيني.
بس بدي لك من السياج تعال.
Sorry, I'm trying to move quick, but it's not possible.
هذه البوابة هيك يعني. أنا كان قاعد الحرس. هذا دول الحواس اللي قاعد الحرس. هون أبونا. هون هذه. هون هذه. هذه مصبنة. مصبنة.
I will go quickly, excuse me. Just to give you an idea while I'm running. Just to give an idea, in this city happened a massacre where 250 people, civilians, were massacred inside a mosque. The testimonies that we will hear are in fact of Palestinians, I mean victims, that were witnessing the massacre on one hand, or took the bodies out of the mosque. It happened to be that it's about. What we have is we have a major testimony of victim, and then we have the choice of a series. So we will have one victim here and another one which is about the fleeing of the refugees. And we have here a possibility to look at the perpetrators related to that. This archive, in fact, is an archive that is being unbuilt in order to try to put together the story of victims and perpetrator, which following the extensive practice that I have behind, that I realized that it's not a question of contradiction. It's not about denial on one side and veracity of the other. It is what we call in cinema champ contre champ. A shot, counter shot. A shot, counter shot is the existence in the same moment, in the same time, of two possibilities of angle, which are not the duplicity of one of the other, which are not the mirror of one of the other, which are two different perspectives that are giving together the possibility of a one place. And this is why I would like to end, and I'm of course shortening up, is that the political task, in fact, that is related to the archive today, what I see the archive through the definition, is a new audiovisual intellectuality, which is an intellectuality which is open source, which annihilate the idea of a closed and so-called open source, inherently collective, and with devices which really provide access to relevant images and allow people to resemble them through different point of view, to reshuffle them, to de-archive and re-archive permanently as a permanent process. Non-linearity can just contribute to building human agencies with its jamation of creativity and its didactical aspects. Thank you very much, and apologize.
Thank you for this wonderful talk that indeed condensed all of the themes that we will be touching upon in the coming lectures. I'm very happy that we have a seminar coming up next morning. We are now running out of time.
Totally, they don't have a moment to insult, to say something.
Let me ask Astrea to ask outside if there is a program that wants to take over the hall, in which case we can continue with the Q&As outside. If we have a little bit of time, then I'm very happy to open it up for discussion, because I'm sure there are lots of comments, questions, and further observations. So, please.
Thank you. It was truly fascinating. I wanted to ask you about two interesting moments in your work and in your presentation relating to time and the colonial and the documentary gaze. One of the first clips you showed was precisely about the founding moment of contemporary cinema, which is contemporary with the birth of anthropology as a colonial project and what is commonly called the savage slot. And it's interesting that both trajectories lead to a certain post-colonial or decolonial moment where in anthropology it's an attempt precisely to capture the incongruities of the colonial, and this is precisely, I think, what you are also trying to do in your work in Israel and Palestine. And the second point is related also to the uncanny re-engagement with the colonial, especially in the film, in the Jaffa film, The Orange's Clockwork. I watched it again this morning, and it's fascinating that in one of the strong, because the Palestinians usually assume the narrative of the victim, right? The blaming, almost a Christian narrative of a victim, seeking kind of some form of nostalgic redemption and closure, and it was actually Nono, the analyst, right, the kind of the brain, the meta commentator, who was also part of the colonizers, who suggested that we actually need to go back to the colonial moment, to the constitutive moment, and rather than the national moment or the nationalizing moment, which was effacing the Palestinian indigenous, and to seek in the colonial moment the kind of an encounter, right? So I think part of both the anthropological and the documentary projects are kind of dealing with these convoluted returns into the original sin?
Well, I think that the answer to the last question, the remark, will be very complicated because of the complexity of this call to go back to the colonial moment, which is in fact the British colonialism on Palestine. It's complicated because of the nature of the colonialism, the colonial Zionism. I mean, colonialism, it's a generic word, but then we have to go inside and to see that there is modes of colonialism. And the settler colonialism in Palestine by Zionism is a specific one, which is also the exclusion of the native from the possibility to work, which is the idea also why Zionism it doesn't think about itself as colonialism. We don't make them to work. They are not our slaves. But we have to remember that this was part of the idea of non-mixing. It's the idea of Jewish labor, which was we don't let them, in fact, to work. And this was a left-wing position, where the right-wing position was let's make out of them workers. So there is this very particularity of this settler colonialism, which is coming back to the fact that the only moment that there was communality was in fact under colonialism, because all the rest it's about separation. This is one. But if you relate it to the question of anthropology, of course, and we have to remember that important anthropologists like Margaret Mead were filmmakers. I mean, the very first, what we call the one that defines documentary, which is Flaherty, going to the north, it's what we call visual anthropology in a certain way. So, in fact, when we're talking anthropology and we're talking documentary, we're talking about almost one practice, and the unpacking of them goes together.
So, as I was told, there is a class that is waiting outside to occupy this space, but we resist and we continue our discussion outside. So please join us.
Don't hesitate.